Greetings all, welcome back to everyone's favourite series on the channel, Worst to Best, where I rank a director's filmography from worst to best as subjectively as possible. In the last episode I had a crack at Paul Thomas Anderson, probably my favourite director of all time, so for this video I've decided to have a go at the internet's favourite director, probably Mr. Quentin Tarantino. Known for his witty dialogue, gratuitous violence, and a rather peculiar fascination with feet, Tarantino has garnered acclaim among critics and casual moviegoers alike. Since his debut in 1992, few directors have gained as much attention and become as prominent in our collective cultural zeitgeist as Quentin Tarantino. Some hate him, many love him, but everyone knows his name. For me personally, Tarantino has always been a mixed bag. He is clearly a very talented writer and director who is incredibly passionate about cinema, and this comes through in every single one of his films and is what I think makes them so watchable. But often in the past I have found his work, particularly post-Jackie Brown, to be just a little too self-indulgent for my taste, and lacking a sense of discipline. The biggest example of this being Kill Bill Volume 1, which I can remember absolutely hating when I first watched it. However, that was a long time ago. I haven't really watched any of his movies in a good few years, and I am definitely due a rewatch of his entire filmography. This ranking will only include the movies he has directed, so no From Dusk Till Dawn or Natural Born Killers or any of those. What will I crown Tarantino's best film? What will be his worst? Will I like Kill Bill this time around? I don't know. I wrote this before I began my rewatch. Let's find out. There is no film which more perfectly exemplifies my frustrations with Tarantino's work than Kill Bill Volume 1. Now, I know I am in the minority here, and I'm not trying to take anyone's enjoyment away. If you like this kind of film, please watch it to your heart's content. I can certainly agree that there are some very good things here technically. Like all of Tarantino's films, Kill Bill Volume 1 looks great. I've always respected the guy's talents as a writer, but only on this rewatch of his filmography have I realised just how great of a director he is. Many of the shots and camera work in Kill Bill Volume 1 are really beautiful and so confident. We have Dutch angles, we have claustrophobic close-ups, we have these hilarious crashing zooms which I actually really enjoy. We have these wide angles during action scenes that are clearly meant to resemble something like Street Fighter and or Kurosawa's samurai movies. This is also perhaps Tarantino's most colourful film. It bursts with primary colours to the point it can feel like you've just opened a comic book. And I will admit, the yellow Bruce Lee inspired tracksuit Uma Thurman wears is incredibly iconic. And of course, as always, the soundtrack is very fitting. I can't deny that the guy has a good ear for music. Well done. But here is the main gist of why I dislike Kill Bill Volume 1. And remember this, kids, because it's going to be a running theme throughout this video. Many of Tarantino's films riff hugely off the exploitation and grindhouse movies he grew up with. You know, the real pulpy, sensationalist, low-budget, provocative stuff from the 70s. However, my main problem with this, and it sounds obvious, is that these films he's so inspired by and trying to emulate were never that good. It was their charm, but also their downfall. There are very few brilliant exploitation movies, so by embracing this style, he is embracing its inherent constraints and limitations. While watching Kill Bill Volume 1, it occurs to me just how little I care about everything, because it is all so surface level. Tarantino himself even described the two Kill Bill films as movies the characters in Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs would go see. So basically what he's saying, and I hope this makes sense, is that Kill Bill is Tarantino squared, which I'm sorry is too much Tarantino. Any depth a story like this might have had is just so diluted. It is like a picture of a picture. It is references and needle drops and blood and winks to the camera and nothing of any substance. And the annoying thing is, we know Tarantino can do depth. We've seen it in the films he made before Kill Bill and in his more recent stuff. I don't really know why he made this. It's almost like he released Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, which are two great films by the way, spoiler alert, then made Jackie Brown, which is also a good one, but which didn't do well at the box office. So he panicked and went, right, well, what did Pulp Fiction do well? Because hey, that won an Oscar, that won the Palme d'Or, that made $200 million. Oh, it was violent. Well, let's make this one 20 times as violent without any of the shock or danger or meaning. Oh, and Pulp Fiction was told in a non-linear fashion. So was Reservoir Dogs. People liked that one, but people didn't like Jackie Brown, so let's make my next movie needlessly out of order to the point where it completely ruins the final 45 minutes, because you already showed us right at the beginning that Lucy Liu's character is dead. But hey, it needs to be as out of order as possible, and while we're at it, let's also give Lucy Liu's character, who is a complete NPC by the way, same with everyone in these movies to be honest, a full-on anime origin story, which, okay look, is pretty cool in a vacuum, but what is this? Why are you showing me this? You say you had no choice but to split Kill Bill into 2 volumes because it was just too long, but then you have padding like this. Dare I say it, it's like Tarantino made a bad movie on purpose. That's what I feel like when watching this. It may be the most hollow film I've ever seen, but apparently I'm alone in this. For God's sake, it's rated 4.2 on Letterboxd. It's rated higher than Mad Max Fury Road. Compare these two. Tell me which one is better. There is a correct answer. It is easily the worst screenplay of his career. I mean, some of the lines are just so jarring. Most of the performances are flat out bad. The pacing is all over the place. I mean, it's presented in chapters, which I never like in films, but also due, like I said, to the fact that the film has to be split into 2. It feels like in the last second, Tarantino had to somehow cram a 3-act structure into this one half of a god-awful movie. And look, you could easily say, no, you're completely missing the point. You're thinking about it too much. It's just a genre film. You're meant to turn your brain off. It's an action flick. But the action isn't even that good. I mean, it's fine, but nowhere near good enough to carry the film, you know? Make no mistake, this is not, in fact, a Mad Max Fury Road, or an Old Boy, or even any of the John Wicks. It's not even close. And look, man, there are films which are completely style over substance, which I love. Under the Skin, The Holy Mountain, Blade Runner, the list could go on, but you need to give me something, some depth, some meaning, something to believe in, something to cling on to, because this is a self-indulgent mess. And it annoys me because I know how good a filmmaker Tarantino is when he's trying, but this just feels like him, dare I say it, playing with toys. Death Proof is the only one of Tarantino's films I hadn't seen before doing this watch through of his entire filmography. And upon finishing it, I can see why many people have this last on their own rankings. However, I do think it's by default better than Kill Bill Volume 1, because it is, you know, watchable. In fact, the first 40 minutes I actually liked quite a bit. If you didn't know, similar to the movie I've just spoken about, Death Proof was originally one half of a bigger project. I am of course talking about Grindhouse, which I have not seen, but was essentially this really cool 3-hour experimental double feature, released in cinemas in 2007 as one package. A package which consisted of Tarantino's Death Proof, Robert Rodriguez's Planet Terror, and a handful of trailers for fictional exploitation movies, which are pretty funny. You should definitely check them out. You can find them on YouTube. Grindhouse, however, did not do well at the American box office, unfortunately. So when it came to releasing the project internationally and on DVD, in an attempt to recoup some of the money it had lost, Death Proof and Planet Terror were marketed and sold as standalone movies, and so therefore we have Tarantino's 6th film. 5th if you, like the man himself, consider the 2 Kill Bill volumes as one movie, which clearly I do not, because, you know, they're not. Because of all this, there is no film in Tarantino's filmography which sticks out more than Death Proof, as it definitely feels like a bit part of something bigger. However, like I said, the first 40 minutes of Death Proof are actually pretty fun in my opinion. Tarantino utilizes older film stock, complete with scratches and damaging, to create this retro, gritty aesthetic. I love when newer movies use old technology and techniques to transport the viewer back in time. I wish this was done more because it always looks and sounds awesome. However, this grindhouse aesthetic which characterizes the first half of Death Proof is dropped in the second half, in favor of a more contemporary feel. Now, I think I mostly understand what Tarantino was going for here. Basically, the first half, which involves a group of young women going out to a bar before being killed by Kurt Russell's stuntman Mike, is Tarantino indulging in the classic cinematic cliches, fetishes, and obsessions of typical grindhouse cinema. while the second half of the film operates as a turning of the tides, as we meet a new group of women who seize control and fight back against these cliches. It's definitely an interesting film, and I don't know if I've ever seen anything like it before. However, once it goes into the more contemporary mode, it kind of completely lost me, at least until the climax of the film, which is hilarious but doesn't exactly feel earned. Overall, Death Proof is definitely one of Tarantino's weaker films, but you should 100% check it out, as it is an incredibly unique viewing experience, and something he has my respect for making. You know, sometimes it's the effort which counts. Yeah, I don't actually mind Kill Bill Volume 2. Sure, it shares many of the problems I have with the first Kill Bill. It is as surface level as you could possibly get, when we know Tarantino is so much better than that, when he's shown he can do so much more. I still don't really care about any of the characters. The action is fine, but nowhere near good enough to keep me engaged for 2 hours. The dialogue is such a huge step down from every single other film he's written. The film is still just a parody of exploitation movies, which were inherently never that good to begin with. The pacing is horrendous. We have random scenes which could have just completely been cut in the editing room, etc, etc, etc. However, wait, hang on. I just thought of another thing, and to me this is unforgivable. Here, once again, Tarantino, for some inexplicable reason, which I can only attribute to his absolute insistence that he must tell the story out of order, begins Kill Bill Volume 2 with the bride driving her car and revealing to the audience in a fourth wall break that she's already defeated the other two members who were teased in the first film, Michael Marsden and Woman with Eye Patch. Quentin, mate, what are you doing? I feel like throughout these two Kill Bill movies, it's like you don't want us to take anything seriously. You're actively destroying any potential tension or emotion any of these scenes may have. Like, yeah, of course we know the bride is going to face Bill eventually, just look at the film's title. I'm not expecting Uma Thurman to get killed by one of the mini-bosses halfway through the movie. But that doesn't mean you still can't build suspense and discomfort throughout this film for the audience. Take Django Unchained, for example. I think we can all agree that one of the best scenes, if not the best scene in that film, is when Django, Dr. Schultz, and Calvin Candy are having a very tense dinner together. It really is nail-biting stuff, and the audience has no real idea about what's going to happen. Now, of course, the movie is called Django Unchained, and we still have an hour left in the runtime, so we are somewhat free to assume that Django is not going to die in this scene, even after Calvin Candy realizes he is being lied to, and the guns come out, and things really start to go sour. But I'm still on the edge of my seat because, well, I don't know for sure what's going to happen. The film is taking place in the present moment, and this is Tarantino we're talking about, who throughout his career has killed off many of his protagonists in surprising ways. But imagine if near the beginning of Django Unchained, Tarantino showed us Jamie Foxx and Kerry Washington riding away from the plantation having blown it up, before cutting back to the beginning and presenting the rest of the story as a flashback. Suddenly, it's all pointless. There's no conflict, there's no stakes. It's basically, screenplay suicide. And the thing is, even if they didn't prematurely reveal all the stuff that's going to happen in these Kill Bill films, I'm still not going to care because you've given me no reason to. But it's actually surreal to watch and analyze all this stuff. Like I said before, it's almost as if Tarantino is going out of his way to make a bad film. And yeah, once again, you can say that this is the point of the Kill Bill movies. They're supposed to be turn your brain off stuff. They're supposed to be these self-aware homages to grindhouse cinema. But clearly he wants the audience to care later down the line. There are clearly scenes we are supposed to get emotional at. Scenes we're supposed to cheer at. But it's all just hollow, empty, shallow filmmaking. And it's got me ranting when I was actually supposed to talk about the stuff I like about Volume 2. Because contrary to the general consensus, I do think this is far superior to Volume 1. In fact, there are moments in this film I quite like. I would go as far as to say that for the very limited ceiling a film like this can have, chapters 8, 9, and 10 are relatively enjoyable, and by a country mile the best this duology has to offer. The cruel tutelage of Pai Mei is a lot of fun. We get the 36th Chamber of Shaolin's very own Gordon Liu playing an incredibly over-the-top 1,000-year-old kung fu master. Once again here, Tarantino is just reminding us of better films we could be watching instead. There's nothing much to it, but I don't know, it's definitely amusing watching him training Uma Thurman. It doesn't touch Kung Fu Panda or anything like that, but I always love a good martial arts training montage, sue me. The ensuing brawl between the bride and Daryl Hannah's character in the trailer is probably the best fight in either of the Kill Bill films. The claustrophobic location and raw feminine anger makes for a pretty engaging scene, and the moment Uma Thurman rips out her eye is a pretty hilarious anti-climax. Would definitely have hit a lot harder if we hadn't already seen this happen in the previous film to some random henchman, but whatever. And I love the bit where Daryl Hannah is being drowned in a toilet bowl, and she flushes the chain so she can breathe again. It's the kind of creativity we all know Tarantino is great at, and while these small moments can't single-handedly save a film, they definitely make the thing far more watchable. And I'll just mention this briefly here. I really like how these two films portray their female characters, highlighting their emotional depth, intelligence, and agency in a genre usually dominated by male protagonists. And it's never screaming it from the rooftops either. It's never saying, hey, look at us, women can fight too, women can be strong too, look at us, we're subverting sexist film tropes. No, like, it's just a thing which goes without saying within the film's world. Good job, Quentin. Anyway, then we have what I think is the best moment in either of these Kill Bill movies, which is the final chapter, the final showdown between the bride and Bill, what we've waited 3.5 hours to witness. And this is what Tarantino does.
Freeze, mommy!
Bang, bang! Oh! Oh!
I find this anti-climax to be actually a rather bittersweet and touching finale to a duology of films I have always found incredibly disappointing. And I think it's interesting that lots of people think the opposite, feeling let down by Volume 2's sentimental final chapter, instead wanting something similar to the quote-unquote epic fight scene at the end of the first film. But I don't know, man. By this point I'm kind of done with all the pointless fighting and actually quite enjoy these two characters just sitting, talking to each other. Uma Thurman and David Carradine both give great performances, and yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, I still don't care that much or anything, but yeah, it's fine. It's nice. I wish the entirety of Kill Bill had this level of emotional nuance and humanity, but oh well. Oh, and I'm sure you'll all respect my opinions on these two Kill Bill movies in the comments, so thanks in advance for that. I really do have the best audience. Okay folks, we've now hit that point in the ranking where the pendulum has officially swung. Every film we're going to be talking about from now on, I really like. In fact, I'd say the quality jump from Kill Bill Volume 2 to Django Unchained is probably the largest one in this entire worst to best video. Django Unchained is perhaps the film most indicative of Tarantino's career as a whole, and sort of acts as a microcosm for both the highs and lows of his filmography. But let's start with the positives, because there are a lot. I think this is one of Tarantino's best acted films. I've already mentioned that dinner scene, which is incredible from a writing perspective, but honestly, having Jamie Foxx, Christoph Waltz, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Samuel Jackson all acting at the top of their game around the same table feels like a cheat code. This is especially the case with Samuel Jackson, who is playing just completely against character. I mean, the polar opposite of his usual sweary, swashbuckling persona. But he manages to be an incredibly convincing, complex villain, and in my opinion, he just about steals the film. Django Unchained would also probably win an award for Tarantino's most badass film, at least conceptually. The idea of a freed slave turned bounty hunter getting revenge on his past owners while killing a bunch of other racist people along the way is just an absolute goldmine for a ton of violent, satisfying set pieces. I think my favourite would have to be Django getting revenge on the Brittle brothers with the help of Dr. Schultz. Fox and Waltz have incredible chemistry, the latter of whom is still doing his polite but very dangerous act from Inglourious Basterds. I'm not surprised he won Oscars for both films, but Right Here also contains some of Tarantino's best cinematography and music supervision. And Django uttering those words,
I like the way you die, boy.
Is just one of the coolest moments in cinema, to be honest. It's a great scene in a film full of great scenes, but I don't think Tarantino and editor Fred Raskin necessarily meld them together in the most satisfying, cohesive way. I think this film is structured very weirdly and suffers hugely from pacing issues. Something I will continue to talk about throughout this video, because I think it's true with many of Tarantino's movies. So while Django Unchained is incredibly well made at points, you know, excellent dialogue, maybe his best use of violence and blood, so many crash zooms which just always make me laugh, I wish this technique was used more in cinema, I can't help but feel like the film's quality is capped due to the lack of restraint in the editing room. See, by this point, it's 2012. Quentin Tarantino is Quentin Tarantino. He's the guy who made Pulp Fiction. He's just come off the critically acclaimed Inglourious Basterds. Who's gonna tell him no? Who's gonna tell him his film needs a trim? The guy is just not the most disciplined filmmaker. I feel like he adores the craft so much that he doesn't want to cut anything. which is kind of fair enough, but it's like what I was saying in my Killers of the Flower Moon video. You need to be able to kill your darlings, you need to be willing to hack away at what you've made, kinda like sculpting a piece of marble, until you have the essence of what the film is. Something like Reservoir Dogs does this perfectly. And yeah, doing this means there is less movie, less badass scenes to be clipped and put onto YouTube, but it means the overall product is stronger as a result. Once we arrive at Candyland, we sort of realise the entire film leading up until this point was essentially a 75-minute prologue. There is no real 3-act structure to this movie. There are certain scenes which go on way too long, and others which honestly a more cutthroat director and editor would have removed entirely. And it leads to something which just feels very disjointed. There are so many great moments in this film, but I feel like they are stronger than the whole. Does that make sense? This is a problem I have with a few more of Tarantino's films, and I'll talk more about it later, but I'd say Django Unchained suffers the most from this, unfortunately. We basically, as I said, have a 75-minute first act, which is more like a prologue. Then the main and best portion of the film at Candyland, lots of tension, lots of great acting, and then you'd probably say the third and final act, which is just crammed into the back end of the film, lasts, 15 to 20 minutes? It's just structured so awkwardly. And yeah, it's a ferocious ending. Jamie Foxx shooting that woman and her flying out of the frame is hilarious.
I said tell Miss Laura goodbye.
Bye, Miss Laura.
But by this point, Tarantino has just about lost me, so none of it really feels as cathartic as it should, as it deserves to. And don't get me started on the scene with Quentin himself. I mean, the guy, bless him, cannot really act or do a convincing Australian accent. But I also think Django convincing the slavers to give him a gun is just one of the dumbest, most poorly written moments in his entire filmography.
Got yourself a deal, Mike.
Django Unchained is so cool, so badass, has so many satisfying moments of violence and tension and pathos, but honestly, the pacing drags it down so much. This does not need to be 165 minutes, I'm sorry. You could easily trim 20 minutes of this, and it would be a far more complete piece of work. But I guess that's why it has Unchained in the title. It's supposed to be this loose, unshackled romp of violence, so whatever. It has some great scenes, and is overall a good movie. I just think Tarantino can do better than this. Similar to Death Proof, Jackie Brown really stands out in Tarantino's filmography. Adapted from Elmore Leonard's 1992 novel Rum Punch, it is the only film of his which was based on existing material. Because of this, I actually think Jackie Brown is quite the breath of fresh air, as it's the only movie of Quentin Tarantino's where every character doesn't basically just talk like Quentin Tarantino. This may be the reason why other people have this a bit lower on their own rankings, but in my opinion it actually lends to the story rather well, overall giving Jackie Brown a far more naturalistic vibe than basically any of his other films. I kind of like to view Tarantino's first 3 movies as his sort of early crime trilogy, and while I obviously rate this below Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, I do think both those films lack a certain maturity which Jackie Brown seems to have in buckets. This is Tarantino at his most restrained, least self-indulgent, and along with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it stands as his most heartwarming work, and features his most 3-dimensional, living, breathing characters. Like I said, it really is a breath of fresh air. Pam Grier and Robert Forster are both excellent, and develop this really wholesome friendship/romantic relationship, which is rather touching. But then you also have the character of Ordell, who is definitely one of Samuel Jackson's nastier characters, I'd say. And of course, I can't talk about Jackie Brown without mentioning Robert De Niro. There's something about this performance and character I can't figure out, because he just kind of sits there the whole time. He's like this really lethargic, bland, unemotional guy who doesn't really do anything, but anytime he's on screen, I can't stop watching him. Don't even get me started on the scene where he shoots Bridget Fonda's character in the middle of a car park because she was being slightly annoying. Just the nonchalance of it all creates, in my opinion, maybe the funniest moment in Tarantino's entire filmography.
I shot him.
And I also can't talk about Jackie Brown without mentioning the soundtrack, which is probably Tarantino's best ever. So I really do like Jackie Brown, if you can't tell. I think it strikes a really good balance between Tarantino's trademark storytelling and something different, something new, something unique, something which feels more grounded and real than his other films, although when put in the context of his filmography, when watched alongside all his other far more bombastic and iconic pieces of work, I can see how one might find this a tiny bit underwhelming, especially when considering this came out only 3 years after Pulp Fiction. But I don't know, man, it's not like Tarantino is reinventing the wheel here. I think he made better movies before Jackie Brown, and he's made better movies since. But at the end of the day, it's just a damn good, consistent, well-paced, well-written, heartwarming crime caper. And I think it's a massive shame that following this he went on to make, in my opinion, his weakest, most immature and self-indulgent piece of work, being, you know, the entire Kill Bill project. However, I am happy to report that after both Kill Bills and Death Proof, Tarantino was able to rein it in just a bit, and begin to find his footing again in what can only really be described as a rather substantial second wind in his directorial career, which of course all started with... Inglourious Basterds is not only a very well-made film, but an incredibly important one in Tarantino's filmography, as, like I said, it really revitalized his career after the botched experiment that was Grindhouse. It was, at the time, the highest grossing film Tarantino had ever made, the first film in 15 years which Tarantino received Oscar nominations for, and was really able to put him back on the map as one of the most exciting and important filmmakers of his generation. And while I probably prefer Jackie Brown and am more likely to rewatch that film in the future, I can't deny that Bastards is the superior piece of work. Much like Django Unchained, Inglourious Basterds is a gratifying and violent slice of revisionism. This time the historical punching bag of slavery being traded in for World War II and the Nazis. However, unlike Django Unchained, which, as I've already stated, can often feel juvenile, undisciplined, and messy, Inglourious Basterds strikes a far more pleasant balance between Tarantino's typically bombastic, violent, and chaotic filmmaking, and a level of maturity and moderation, especially in the editing room, which hadn't really appeared in any of his films since Jackie Brown. So by combining this far tighter pacing with some excellent performances, and the stylish directorial finesse demonstrated in Kill Bill, now complemented with a brilliant central premise, Inglourious Basterds offers a tight, tense exploration of Nazi-occupied France, a perfect setting for Tarantino to flex his muscles as both a writer and director. I can absolutely see why this is now regarded as one of Tarantino's best. In fact, I believe on Letterboxd it is his highest rated film. However, there are a few reasons why I have only been able to place Inglourious Basterds at number 5 on this list. First of all, and this is an issue I have with many of his films, I think Tarantino prefers directing scenes over movies. Let me explain. Inglourious Basterds contains many brilliant set pieces. You know, that tense introduction with Christoph Waltz, the Bear Jew scene with the baseball bat, Drei Glasser, Antonio Margaretti, and of course, that explosive ending, among others. However, I feel like the whole of Inglourious Basterds is inferior to the sum of its parts. Case in point, the coolest thing about this film are the titular bastards. The idea of a swashbuckling band of soldiers, led by Brad Pitt in one of his most charismatic performances, parading around France scalping Nazis is obviously very cool, and anytime they're actually on screen, I'm completely engrossed. Unfortunately, this movie isn't really about the bastards. Their screen time is nowhere near what it should be, and if you take them out of the film, nothing changes plot-wise. Instead, we have all this stuff with Shoshana, which takes up like half of the entire movie, where she plans to blow up Hitler and the rest of the Nazis in her cinema. And yeah, I completely understand what Tarantino is doing here, destroying what is widely recognized as the pinnacle of evil through the power of movies. I mean, it's cool, it's a very Tarantino-y thing to do. However, not only do I personally find Shoshana kind of annoying, but I also think she's just a rather bland, one-dimensional character, who doesn't really do much for me, especially in contrast to the bastards who are so compelling. Like, I get more satisfaction in that one moment where Eli Roth is maniacally firing bullets into Hitler's corpse, than the entire thing with the cinema going up in flames as we hear Shoshana's laughs from beyond the grave. The whole film feels like a tug-of-war between the Bastards plot and the Shoshana plot, but neither ever gets enough screen time to really flourish, and they just aren't connected well at all. Like I've already said, if you remove the titular Inglourious Basterds from the movie, the Nazis still all die. So their entire inclusion, all those great scenes throughout the movie, just seem rather pointless in the end. just padding to make the film longer. So sure, we have all these great set pieces, but I don't think they necessarily meld together to create the most coherent story. It's similar to Django Unchained in this way. It's almost like Tarantino started by deciding what scenes he wanted to shoot, then worked backwards to find a narrative they could all fit into. It doesn't ruin the movie or anything. Like I said, many of the individual scenes are really incredible, but I think the various plot lines in the film could have been far more effectively interwoven, like what we see in Pulp Fiction, for example. The other problem I have with Inglourious Basterds, which I never hear anyone talking about and I can't work out why, is the villain, Colonel Hans Landa. Now, of course, Christoph Waltz is perfect as the character. He basically steals every scene he's in. However, I cannot for the life of me work out what Tarantino was thinking when he wrote the ending for this character. For those who can't remember, Hans Landa basically gives up at the end of the movie. He's aware of the bastards' plot to kill all the Nazis, but instead of thwarting it, he turns cloak and abandons the Nazis, cutting a deal with the Americans in exchange for safe passage through the Allied lines and a full pardon. Now, not only does this completely come out of nowhere, there's zero foreshadowing that this was ever in the cards, but the way it all happens kind of ruins the character for me, because Landa is shown throughout the film to be this incredibly smart, dangerous man. He's seen speaking 4 different languages, he's scary, he's incredibly competent, and then he just surrenders to Brad Pitt at the end, despite knowing the reputation of the bastards. Now, I know it's enjoyable to see a Nazi acting like a bitch, but literally, in the space of 2 minutes, the character we all thought was this smart, dangerous guy turns into this idiotic bloke who clearly only cares about himself and doesn't really think ahead. It's such a bizarre decision from a writing perspective, and takes so much away from all those brilliant scenes where he's so scary. And people will claim Hans Landa to be one of the greatest villains in cinema history. It's like if Javier Bardem from No Country for Old Men decided to turn himself in near the end of the movie, so Tommy Lee Jones wouldn't have to feel so old and out of touch. I really have never been able to understand what Tarantino was thinking here. So, look, overall I think Inglourious Basterds is a very well-made film. It has some iconic scenes, great dialogue. But I just still don't think this is Tarantino at his best. It seems to rely so heavily on its individual set pieces, but when you take a step back and look at the film, I just don't think it's that coherent, and is quite easy to poke holes in. Probably the most surprising placement on this ranking, but what can I say? I really like The Hateful Eight. It seems to gather all the ingredients of Tarantino's filmography I personally love into one film, while discarding most of the things which never really worked for me. The most obvious example of this is the similarities it has to Reservoir Dogs, a film I'll be talking about in a bit. Specifically the single cramped location, the claustrophobic paranoia, and the feeling that no one can really be trusted. But The Hateful Eight turns all of these things up to 11. It's like Reservoir Dogs on steroids, for better and for worse. Tarantino does such a good job at creating this freezing, icy, hateful environment. With each breath a character takes, you can see the cold air. Each line a character speaks, you can feel the lingering suspense, the growing suspicion. It's remarkable what Tarantino does with this single setting. He's able to keep me completely engrossed for nearly 3 hours in this one small cabin. And it's not even like there's much violence, at least not until the second half. But The Hateful Eight also contains the wit and biting monologues of something like Pulp Fiction. There's an incredible scene in this film where Samuel L. Jackson really wants to kill Bruce Dern's character because he's some, racist Confederate. So he places a gun next to the old man before going on this absolutely ridiculous speech about how he met his son on a snowy mountain and forced him to perform oral pleasure before letting him freeze to death. It's this surreal monologue, one of the craziest scenes Tarantino has ever attempted. And of course Bruce Dern goes for the gun but is far too slow for Samuel L. Jackson. It's such a well-executed, tense sequence in a film full of them. In fact, the whole movie kind of feels like the Inglourious Basterds basement set piece, or the dinner scene from Django Unchained, but drawn out to nearly 3 hours. The whole thing actually, at times, feels closer to a traditional play than your standard Tarantino cinematic romp. I think that's why I like it so much. It trades the epic scale of Inglourious Basterds or Django Unchained for something far more contained and personal, all the while retaining their beautiful period set and wardrobe designs and impeccable filmmaking. Combining this with one of Ennio Morricone's greatest ever scores, which is really saying something. stunning ultra-wide 70mm cinematography from Robert Richardson, and my penchant for cold climates. The Hateful Eight really is a personal favourite of mine. It contains some of my favourite characters from any of Tarantino's films, including, as I've already mentioned, Samuel Jackson's Major Marcus Warren, John the Hangman Ruth, maybe my favourite performance of Kurt Russell's career. Honestly, he's hamming it up so much, but it completely works. And then of course Walton Goggins' Chris Mannix, who I think provides an extra layer of depth the film really needed. A layer of depth perhaps the Kill Bills and Django Unchained didn't really have. Throughout the film there's this question of whether or not he's the sheriff he claims to be, or if he's even, a good man. And I think by the end of The Hateful Eight, these questions are answered in a really bittersweet and satisfying way. In fact, I don't think since Pulp Fiction have characters felt so morally ambiguous before. The Hateful Eight may not be for everyone, it's definitely a slower burn than some of Tarantino's other films, but I don't know man, I think it's incredibly underrated and actually one of his best. And I never really noticed the runtime. I think Fred Raskin's editing here is a great improvement from Django Unchained. I guess my only flaw would be that I don't necessarily think The Hateful Eight is the most rewatchable film on this list. It's actually the only movie I had to watch again on this rewatch, and I did find that once you know all the characters' motivations, once you know what's about to go down, some of the tension is lost, unlike say Reservoir Dogs, where even on your 100th rewatch it's still so exciting and suspenseful. But The Hateful Eight is still a film I think slaps pretty hard. I guess for me it's a good combination of Tarantino's early period, middle period, and late period, kind of all rolled into one. It's not a movie which necessarily revolutionizes Tarantino's style, but it just about perfects it for me. And this shot is just... oh my god. Now I know I talk a lot about recency bias and how prevalent it is in the online film community, but I genuinely think Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is one of Tarantino's best films, and to be honest I can only see this absolute juggernaut of nostalgia becoming more acclaimed with time. Let me explain. This is without a doubt his funniest piece of work. In fact, I'd go as far as to straight up call this thing a comedy. It has shades of Linklater, Altman, the Coen brothers, it's this very laid-back, meandering American fairy tale. But it still feels like something only Tarantino could have really made. Because if you look at his career, it's so influenced by the golden age of Hollywood, which of course this film is essentially a love letter to, depicting the time period in its dying embers. And yeah, once again, this movie is not what you would call tight. Scenes go on for much longer than you sort of think they're going to. But while I've spent a lot of time in this video complaining about the pacing, editing, and discipline of Tarantino's movies, I think here the almost lazy flow to the whole thing works in the movie's favour, especially when considering the themes it's dealing with. Robbie Collin, one of my absolute favourite film critics in the world, makes this really good point about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where he talks about the drifting, roaming, wandering pace of this film. How much of the runtime is essentially just downtime. We are greeted to so many moments of characters just chilling, driving around, watching TV, watching movies, utterly oblivious that time is running out, so completely unaware that this iconic world they have grown so comfortable with is about to drastically change forever. It gives the whole film this very, I don't want to say tragic vibe, because I actually find it all rather heartwarming, but certainly a bittersweetness I don't think any of his other films have really been able to achieve. This is easily his most poignant and cathartic film, especially with that ending. In my opinion, Tarantino's most successful attempt at rewriting history. When I'm talking about the lack of depth and substance in films like The Kill Bills, and to a lesser extent stuff like Inglourious Basterds and Django Unchained, this is what I'm referring to. I want this level of depth from all his films, to be honest, because clearly the guy is capable of pulling it off with aplomb. Like I mentioned earlier, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, along with Jackie Brown, contains the most three-dimensional, living, breathing characters of Tarantino's entire filmography. In fact, the whole film, despite presenting itself as a sort of fairy tale, does have this sense of realism which his other movies lack. Like, for example, I love Pulp Fiction, don't get me wrong, but I can't envision stepping into that world. It's too contrived, too artificial, too perfect. And look, clearly it works in that movie's favour. However, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is perhaps the first of Tarantino's films where the world he's presenting to us feels like this living, breathing organism, where each street, each Hollywood film set, each character continues to exist, even after the camera has panned away. Do you know what I mean? Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth are two of Tarantino's best ever creations. Both Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt absolutely kill it. I adore the scenes with them together. They have such an unforgettable bromance, but I also love the middle portion of the film when they're separated. There's this really clever contrast where Rick is on set playing the villain in a western. Probably the best acting of someone acting I've ever seen, to be honest. I can imagine it's a really hard thing to pull off. But anyway, Rick's in this saloon, and he can't remember his lines, and it's really great. Meanwhile, his stuntman Cliff is investigating the Manson hippie cult on an old western film set, getting into some violent, tense shenanigans and overall being a badass. Kind of like a cowboy for real. And Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is filled with these smart moments of mature filmmaking. Like, there are sometimes scenes which, on your first watch, seem, in the moment, to be kind of pointless. I think this is a complaint that a lot of people originally had about the film. Like, for example, the bit with Cliff Booth and his dog in the trailer. But there's always a payoff. It all makes sense in the end. I actually think it's a far more disciplined movie than people initially gave it credit for. Like, even with the whole Bruce Lee scene, look, we can talk about whether this scene is in bad taste. I don't really know enough about Bruce Lee to comment on it, to be honest. But it's this 10-minute Family Guy-esque cutaway, essentially just for one joke. However, it completely works for me. It's one of the funniest jokes in the movie just because of how ridiculous but simultaneously well executed it is. Tarantino is fully committed to telling this joke. And Once Upon a Time in Hollywood constantly gets away with these more, self-indulgent moments because the world and characters are just so damn likable. Yes, it can sometimes drag. Yes, there are things I maybe would have cut, or at the very least trimmed down. But at the end of the day, I don't really care, because it's all so fun to watch. I'm not surprised that Tarantino has gone on record calling Once Upon a Time in Hollywood his best movie. Obviously, I don't personally think it's his best, but I can see why he said this, especially when considering the ending, which not only ties the film up incredibly well, but which also happens to be some of the most fun I've ever had in a cinema. I remember so clearly watching this for the first time, and let me tell you, the moment Brad Pitt throws the can of dog food at that screaming lunatic, I don't think I've ever laughed more while watching a film. And the final scene where Sharon Tate invites Rick Dalton into her house, it's such a heartwarming, cathartic ending. It feels like Tarantino really opening up and showing a level of emotion to us which we haven't really seen from him before. And the title card fading in during that final shot, with its fairy tale-like font, it really puts a nice bow on what is undoubtedly one of Tarantino's best and most mature pieces of work. Yeah, I still think it could do with a slight trim. There are moments which lull just a bit, but like I said, this is sort of the point of the movie. Quentin, congratulations. You finally made a film where your somewhat, let's call it awkward and undisciplined pacing actually works in the film's favour, so fair enough. So if we're not counting Four Rooms, which Tarantino only technically directed a quarter of, and we're therefore considering Reservoir Dogs as his first feature film, I can confidently say that this is one of the greatest directorial debuts ever made. No question about it. Usually it can take a few movies for a director to really nail down their style and introduce themselves to the world. Because, making films and establishing a unique voice is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Consider movies like Hard Eight or Bottle Rocket. They're not bad by any means, but they clearly reflect the work of directors who are still in the process of defining their identity as a filmmaker. However, Reservoir Dogs is a complete outlier in this regard. It belongs to a highly exclusive category of films that introduce their directors as fully formed right out of the gate. Even watching this in 2023, I can still feel the excitement radiating from every frame, which audiences all around the world must have felt in 1992. The thing is just so confident, so self-assured, so energetic. It feels like something a director would make at the peak of their powers, not the debut movie of a guy who wrote the script in 3 weeks. Pretty much all of Tarantino's iconic trademarks are introduced here. Violence, check. Profanity, check. Benign conversations with references to pop culture, check. Non-linear storytelling, check. Shots from the trunk of a car, check. However, not only are they all present right here from the beginning, but this film still to this day contains some of Tarantino's best uses of these trademarks. For example, yes, Reservoir Dogs is violent, it's very bloody, and it actually caused many people to walk out when it was first shown in festivals, including, funnily enough, horror director Wes Craven. But the violence always has a purpose, as opposed to films like Django Unchained or The Kill Bills, where it's thrown around so much it loses a bit of the shock and oomph. The first time we witness blood in Reservoir Dogs is after the opening credits, where we see Tim Roth bleeding out in the back of a car. We'll talk more about the non-linear structure of this film in a second, but it completely comes out of nowhere and really shocks you, especially after the very cool and slick opening 10 minutes. And the violence in this film never really stops shocking you. You never really get desensitized to it because it's always presented in a new and surprising way. For example, the first moment we actually see violence firsthand, which is when Steve Buscemi, who in my opinion steals the film, is running away from the botched heist. Now this takes place 20 minutes into the film, and is the first scene which actually happens outside. It's in broad daylight, there are members of the public just walking around, and bang, we have assault, we have carjacking, we have a shootout with the cops. It's like you're suddenly thrown into a Grand Theft Auto game. Then there's that iconic scene with Michael Marsden, which not only changed everyone's relationship with the song Stuck in the Middle of You, but goes to show you just how psychotic this character is. It starts to paint a picture of the fabled heist that we never actually get to see. And then, of course, there's perhaps the most surprising moment in Reservoir Dogs, when Tim Roth's Mr. Orange shoots Mr. Blonde, comes out of absolutely nowhere. As we were so caught up in the torture of the cop, we've kind of forgotten about the dying man just out of frame. And also remember, at this point, we don't know he's a cop. It's only right after this that we get the revelation. And of course the commode story, which I think to this day is one of Tarantino's crowning achievements. The way that it's all cut together, the way Tim Roth gets better at telling the story the further along the story goes. And the further along the story goes, the more real it becomes. We go from him learning the lines of the story, to practicing the story, to performing the story, to us seeing the fake story come alive. The whole thing lasts like 5 or 6 minutes, but it's so elegantly told, so boldly presented to us. It really is just excellent filmmaking. But it isn't the only use of non-linear storytelling. The entire film is jumbled, but in a way which completely makes sense. I mean, if you put all the scenes in chronological order, or even if you just swap 2 scenes around, the movie just wouldn't work at all. Take the very first scene, for example. It occurs right before the heist, but is able to tell us so much about the characters and what's going to happen. Kinda like that scene at the beginning of Shaun of the Dead. The conversation about Madonna and tipping not only grounds these criminals in a relatable reality, but also subtly hints at their personalities and dynamics. Mr. Pink doesn't believe in tipping, revealing he puts himself before anyone else, and foreshadowing him being the only survivor. It's Mr. White who stands up for the waitresses who rely on tips, foreshadowing him standing up for Mr. Orange at the end of the movie. And of course it's Mr. Orange who rats out Mr. Pink as the non-tipper, foreshadowing him as the cop. The whole thing is just classic Tarantino, it's so efficient. And that's what I'd call Reservoir Dogs if I had to sum it up in one word: efficient. The thing is 99 minutes long, was made for around $2 million, but seems to encapsulate Tarantino's style of storytelling so perfectly. It's almost like directors do better when they're given less resources and have to rely on their creativity and ingenuity. You know, perhaps with more money and creative control, Tarantino would have actually shown the heist taking place. But for me, that's the genius of the film. It shuns what most movies would usually show in favour of everything else. It's a masterclass in tense, exciting, character-driven narrative. Maybe I would have cut the scene where Mr. Blonde is recruited. I feel like it's the only moment in the film where the pacing slows down a bit, but it's a small nitpick. Reservoir Dogs is one of the best directorial debuts of all time, and honestly, I don't blame Tarantino for never being able to top this. It really is his best film. It's his best film. He never made anything better than this. Like, I can't think of anything. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room. I feel like usually when people talk about Pulp Fiction these days, it's with this really worn-out, cynical attitude. Because sure, the movie is so iconic. It's probably the most quoted film of all time. You know, whether that's Ezekiel 25:17, Royale with cheese, I shot Marvin in the face, Zed's dead baby, Zed's dead, the list could go on. It's so famous, especially among film fans on the internet, that even mentioning the movie these days is usually met with eye rolls. And I admit, this follows through to my attitude whenever I have to rewatch Pulp Fiction, whether it be for a video like this or when I was studying film at university. I never really want to watch it. I never really think I'm going to enjoy it, because let's face it, everyone knows the film back to front. Every scene is ingrained into my head. I've seen every line on some white guy's hoodie. Everyone's always talking about it. However, it always goes like this. About 5 minutes into my rewatch of Pulp Fiction, I think, oh yeah, it's It's Pulp Fiction. There's a reason this is so popular, because, well, it's really good. You know, I'm not going to go into every small detail as to why this is Tarantino's best film, because we'll be here all day and you've heard it all before. But it really is crazy that after all these years, every character, every line, every moment of hilarity or violence or redemption or romantic tension or philosophy is just as completely engrossing as it was the first time I saw it. This is not just Tarantino's best screenplay, but one of the greatest screenplays ever written. It takes the groundwork laid in Reservoir Dogs and builds a mansion on top of it. All three of the stories are not only brilliant as standalone adventures, but intertwined so smoothly. They really do feel like parts of a larger narrative, something I think Tarantino has struggled to do since Pulp Fiction. But it all seems so effortless, so smooth. I think it's one of the best paced films ever. The thing flies by, it never really stops being engaging. And also, Pulp Fiction, it looks so good. I only realised this on this most recent rewatch. But there's something about the lighting and cinematography of this film which just makes it look completely different to anything else Tarantino has ever made. It's just so colourful and fun and deeply, deeply American. I guess the only obvious flaw to talk about is that infamous scene with Quentin himself. Not only because he's a bad actor in a film filled with otherwise brilliant performances, but yeah, because of the N-word stuff. Look, I'm not going to go too much into it, I haven't mentioned it when talking about Django Unchained or The Hateful Eight, because, you know, those films are set in the 19th century, it does sort of make sense. But, yeah, this scene is really weird. It's just the fact he wrote the movie, then played the character who says the N-words loads, and literally for zero reason. Like, it adds absolutely nothing to the scene or film, and because of this it really stands out just because of how airtight the rest of Pulp Fiction's screenplay is. But anyway, awkwardly badly acted N-word scene aside, this film is Tarantino's magnum opus. Yes, I know, very hot take. It's just like the essence of him as a filmmaker. He almost didn't have to make anything after this because it kind of sums his style up perfectly. I guess that maybe explains why Tarantino never really tried to make another Pulp Fiction, instead going in a variety of different and crazy directions, from depicting the simmering tensions after the American Civil War to homages to 70s grindhouse cinema. And while I maybe prefer this original style, I do respect him for branching out and trying different things after making Pulp Fiction, even if the depth of a film like this or Reservoir Dogs didn't necessarily always translate to his other pieces of work. And that's gonna be it. Quentin Tarantino, worst to best. Don't get me wrong, incredibly talented filmmaker. Not all his stuff works for me 100% of the time, but it's just nice to watch a guy clearly very passionate about making movies, doing exactly that. Please let me know your own rankings in the comment section and tell me why Kill Bill Volume 1 is actually a full-blown masterpiece, and until next time.